Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of RWJF, I want to share a warm welcome to you all. My name is Erin Kelly. I'm the Digital Communications Manager at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Thanks for joining today. It's really nice to share this space together for a common discussion. I'm looking forward to the next hour, as is my colleague, Nick Dean, the Director of Digital Strategy at Burness Communications. He and I will talk about how to do rapid response with deep respect to your digital audience. So as we speak right now, we're about 3 months, 120 days or so into the COVID pandemic in America. During this time, our nation has seen the growing power of the Black Lives Matter movement make the larger public, politicians take notice of how Black people are systematically targeted for violence. And when a time of a public health crisis or a swell of concern for members of our society comes along, all of us might find ourselves asking similar questions. Should we keep doing what we're doing, what we've planned to do? Or should we pause and wait and take some direction from others and how they're handling things? Or how can we best keep doing important work amidst the backdrop of what's happening, especially if or when tensions start to build internally? So we'll talk about all those things today, but we have to remember that the times we lived in are marred with threats of information, misinformation, a lack of trust, destabilizing uncertainty, and this perpetual feeling of information overload. So all of that can make our digital communications even more challenging. So we'll start today by taking a quick look at the 2020 Edelman Trust Barometer to get today's conversation started. They offered a spring update. They examined trust amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, and it revealed a remarkable shift in the landscape since just January. As you can see in the top left of this chart, government trust surged to an all-time high of making it the most trusted institution for the first time in their 20 years of study. And what we see is that the pandemic appears to have cast a spotlight on systemic inequities. A large majority of respondents believe that those with less education, less money, and fewer resources are bearing a disproportionate burden of the suffering and the risk of illness, and they're needing to sacrifice in the pandemic. This means our work is paying off, but we cannot lay off the accelerator. And on the left side, you see a chart here that really signals that search for reliable information related to the pandemic and issues of equality has driven trust in news sources to an all-time high. Despite these high levels, there's still an urgent need for credible, unbiased journalism because concerns about fake news still loom large. So how can we best work in this ecosystem to be effective, to build trust, and engage and educate our community when it matters most to promoting health equity? That's what Nick and I are here to talk about. So Nick and I are going to go through the next slide together, the most important elements to a rapid response strategy. The first item we posit to you today is to be nimble. Teams have to be open to and prepared to making shifts in our content strategies. And some of the case studies that Nick will share with us today will show how organizations and brands are shifting in real time. Honestly, what was relevant in February wasn't relevant in conversations in April, and the things that were trending and relevant in April are not relevant today. We all have to adapt in real time and record time, and it puts a big amount of responsibility on the content strategy team. So creating content in times of crisis, we believe it requires us to do 4 things: to listen, to understand your value, your organization's value, and double down on it, to be relevant. A lot of brands actually started to lean into wellness way ahead of the pandemic, but now this public health crisis has many of us really focused about communicating health and safety. For us at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, that means we continue to build trust, and trust requires that we lead with both evidence and science. And the last thing around this area is not to let your monitoring slack and be ready to respond, keeping your lines open and working to offer replies when warranted. So I also want to note before kicking it over to Nick to talk about item 2 is that social is becoming, with social and digital, is becoming an escape platform for people. And you might say Some Good News is a great example of that, where Jim from The Office rose to the occasion. That production helped many of us find a smile, a laugh, or an opportunity to just find common ground with someone when we really needed it most. It quite simply lifted our spirits and when we all felt out of sorts. So sometimes social and digital, when you think about what your value is and how to be relevant, it's okay to think outside the box.
Thanks, Erin. The next thing we want to talk about is that it's really important during rapid response strategy to put people first. So you need to put effort towards where it matters most, especially online, which is your audience. We know that audiences are made up of a variety of identities, of experiences, of emotions. And during rapid response moments, it's really important to be thinking about what your audience is expecting from you, but more than that, what they're going through and what they're experiencing. One of the things that I've seen time and time again that organizations get wrong is putting the organization first, the important things they want to say, the resources that they have to give, and never really thinking, wait a minute, what if I'm one of the people I'm sending this out to? And also, what are people seeing in the feeds that we're sending out to before and after us? So if you can think about all of that, it becomes a lot easier to think about whether or not this is something we should be putting out or if it needs to change in some way when you're doing that rapid response moment. So I often like to look at my own personal feeds as a consumer, as a follower, as a supporter of organizations, when I'm doing and making content for something that I'm working on, to consider whether or not in this rapid response moment it makes sense. How will it look to put this piece of content out if I put it right here in the middle of my feed and this came before it and this came after it? So incredibly important to put people first and think about what they'll see.
Thanks, Nick. So our third area is about being thoughtful and critical. Just asking yourself and your team, do we need to say anything? If we do, why? And who should be part of our overall internal vetting process? So being thoughtful might mean that if there's a trending moment and it's not in your organization's wheelhouse, don't chase it down. Don't try to make everything work for your organization and use it as a moment pivot to your latest blog post and really try to make that happen. Look to the voices who need to be lifted up and heard, and find ways to amplify those voices or stay out of their way. And maybe you decide to do a little less at a certain moment in time. Also, being thoughtful means not falling back on old habits. They might need to be broken and times might be different. So sometimes you're going to look at your editorial calendar and you should be critical about your best laid plans. That includes any paid advertising plans, or it might be pulling back those earlier plans because it's not a relevant time, because it's a noisy time, because you're going to be matched with some challenges in getting through to your audience because they have other priorities that are pressing at the moment. So always be critical about the best laid plans because you might find a really important opportunity to shift.
And the last piece here that we find really important during rapid response strategy is to connect. So social media allows us to scale up our connections with our audience members. One thing that I've seen do really well is online community management during rapid response. This means paying attention to responses to tweets, to comments on Facebook, maybe to Instagram comments for questions. It can tell you two things. What are you missing that your audience is looking for? The questions that keep coming up may point you into a direction of what you need to create or provide or give links to individuals. And second, what are you missing in terms of how something is received? So you may see criticism in the comments, you may see pushback, and that can help you understand maybe you missed something in this first round. Normally in a rapid response moment, there are several opportunities of going out to your digital audience, and so you get real-time feedback. So to connect to your audience and really listen to what they're saying during this time, it may feel like there's not time to do that during a rapid response moment, but it's actually incredibly important and the most helpful thing to see how things are being received and what feedback you're getting. So again, connect to those audience members. The other thing I'll say is that I personally, during rapid response moments, if I'm a supporter or something like that, when I see that an organization is in the comments and responding to people and being active, it influences how I think about that brand, how I think about that organization, and how I see their commitment to their mission. So just because you only have 6 comments and you responded to 6 comments doesn't mean hundreds of people haven't seen that the organization went the extra mile to respond to people and give them what they wanted. So when we say connect, there's also this kind of lurker aspect of seeing how brands are responding and acting and organizations are responding and acting, and that adding something to who you are as an organization. So with that, I wanted to show a couple examples that Erin and I pulled together from our feeds to show a couple ways that people adapted to moments. So going from left to right, on the left, the Arena Summit is an organization that trains political staff who want to work on all levels of political campaigns. They normally do in-person week-long trainings. Obviously, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, that couldn't happen. At the end of their in-person trainings, they normally did a massive group photo of the hundreds of people they were training. Because they were on Zoom for a week, at the end, I love that they did this collage and they still put it out so that one, the people who were attending had something, but two, us audience members who might support what they work on saw this connection that they did pivot during the pandemic and were still able to kind of keep a spirit alive of things, a tradition that they had. So just thought that was great content for them to put out. In the middle is Dr. Kira Banks. She's an expert on equity and racial equity and has her own kind of podcast and platforms where she talks about that. I started seeing her immediately put out content related to, this one's related to the stages of grief during the pandemic when you're navigating the pandemic. She's also done several webinars about how you talk to your children about racial equity when we saw some of the responses to Minneapolis come up. And so I just thought she has a really great social feed where you can see some of this responses, and also the content that she's sharing is just fantastic. On the right, completely separate from the first two, Bon Appetit magazine, they put out their April issue, and I just liked their caption here about how obviously when they were starting on their April issue in December, they had no clue this is what the April issue was going to go out into, which it's a really good example of how we were all kind of thrown off. But I like that they changed this caption to acknowledge that, to say we made this magazine before we knew this was happening. We had a lot of these plans, but here's why we think it's still helpful or important, and here's some of the things that you can find. They could have easily just said, here's what's happening in April, we're Bon Appetit magazine, we're not going to talk about the pandemic. But again, it kind of shows that your audience members are facing something. You can't just put things out there and not acknowledge them. These next three show a couple other different responses. On the left, Dr. Tedros from the WHO. I like the celebratory nature of this and how we saw some of the ways that people wanted to then celebrate some of the heroes of the people who were working on the front lines. And I thought this was a nice way to kind of capture that and was eye-catching in the feed. In the middle, from Children's National Hospital, they did a very kind of rapid urgent response fund and started doing, this is an Instagram ad that I saw from them, showing that the work that they were doing on the front lines, and then from an online fundraising perspective, doing that. On the right, the mayor of Chicago, using memes as a way to help encourage people to stay inside and follow some of the public health safety guidelines. This is an endorsement for any of these platforms or the people who are sharing. It's more just examples that we're seeing across the board of people leaning into the platforms to get their message across. And you'll notice that those things do well. It's not just straight messaging, it's not just straight sentences, but it's thinking about how we can make this content something that people want to consume and that they're used to consuming on these platforms. Here on the far left, we've got a couple of celebrity examples as well. Erin and I thought it would just be interesting to pull out that this really went across all sectors. It wasn't just the WHO and public health nonprofits, but we saw celebrities, chefs, Netflix, other entertainment industry people come out and do things as well. So Samin Nasrat is a famous chef. She wrote Salt, Fat, Acid, and Heat, dedicated her Instagram to showing Black chefs and the work that they're doing. Demi Lovato passed her platform and allowed 3 young activists to use all of her followers and the platform she has to tell their message and what they were thinking. And then Erin found this really great example from a Netflix show that then kind of pivoted some of their work to support Black Lives Matter. It's just an example that it's not just nonprofits that have to pivot. Everyone across the industry pivots in ways that are important. Some of them may be late, some of them maybe not enough, but in all ways, people are thinking about this. And so when I talked earlier about thinking about where your content is going, when you're in a feed and everyone else has pivoted and you haven't thought about it, that can be a really bad look and point it out even further. So we can find inspiration from tons of different industries about how to pivot and how to use what we have in front of us, even if we're small nonprofits. We also wanted to point out that another big thing has happened even during this time. There was a movement, the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, to stop all advertising spending on Facebook during the month of July as a boycott and a way to send a message of changes that people wanted to see on this platform. We saw content change. Obviously, I'm sure internally we saw spending change. And in general, this was another thing that people had to be ready to respond rapidly to. How were they treating Facebook as a platform? Were they investing money there? Was this something they wanted to be a part of as an organization? Did they support the changes that were being called for? And so we just wanted to point that out, that there have been a mix of things happening in the world, as there always are, but especially now. And people have been responding. You see here on the right, the organization NAACP and their response to the Stop Hate for Profit campaign. I think all month we'll see more content come out around that and hopefully change too.
So I'll just make a quick note that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation decided that we too, after learning about this campaign from our partners at the NAACP, we decided to pause all advertising on that platform through at least the end of July as well. We have a very modest budget there, but we believe that joining this effort really aligned with our guiding principles, and that's the reason why we've ceased our advertising there. So if any of what you've heard so far resonates with you, put it in the chat. If anything about what you're to hear resonates with you, or if you've done that too, put it in the chat, because what I'm about to share is quite simply how RWJF was doing rapid response during COVID since March. So there's the work, and then there's the communications work. And what was really obvious early on for us was that the communications work meant keeping both internal and external audiences informed and engaged. So I want to share with all of you that the one important thing we had done before all of this was have a crisis communications team and plan. That team's charge is to effectively manage a crisis, keeping all members informed of all facts at all times, to coordinate how an external event impacts our operations, and determine appropriate action. And their coordination and their leadership has led to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation providing $50 million to support those facing the greatest strain during the COVID pandemic. That was announced in April. And we also saw an opportunity for a resource that would add value for one of our most important audiences. We released the Health Equity Principles for State and local leaders in responding to, recovering, and reopening from COVID. That was produced explicitly for our state and local leaders to guide their equitable reopening. Now, both of those probably don't sound like they have much to do with digital, but this work does trickle down into digital communications. For example, we cleared the social media slate, and we prioritized all of RWJF's outbound marketing and messaging with a very clear editorial focus for our brand. And it helped us make those decisions that we needed to make a lot easier and clearer, especially when you're dealing with a few different members of the department. So since March, what's driven our editorial decisions has been 4 COVID marketing priorities: nutritional supports, family and income supports, housing, and healthcare coverage and access. And I think if you follow us on social media, or if you're subscribed to our email, you're going to see that come through very clearly. That was a really important unifying operational point for us. So here's a little bit of our website and how we adapted. So we felt that the most important thing for us to do from day one was to point people where to go for trusted and timely COVID information. So that meant on our homepage, which you see on the left side, we featured links to the CDC and NIH. Unrelated, all staff added those resources into our email signature lines too. Then shortly thereafter, we created a dedicated page of COVID-related news, research, and grantee information, and that's the component you see of this person and their lovely dog on the left side. As the weeks passed, we continued to spread all of that relevant information. We're managing that page, updating that page, and also putting those resources throughout our website on relevant topic pages. For our blog, we adapted our approach in 3 main ways. The blog editor has prioritized lifting up first-hand lived experiences. We acknowledged that posting about the crisis wasn't sufficient. We really wanted to be committed to representing and shining a light on lived experiences by sharing third-party unique perspectives. We also took a look at the pipeline, and we halted work on a blog that we were developing with the CEO of a food bank, because obviously priorities shifted, and we wanted to give that person time and space and flexibility to do their work, not get something done for the big funder. So, making an ask of people, you need to think about what's on their plates as well. The second way that the blogs supported our COVID shift was by highlighting really relevant, timely research, such as the impacts of SNAP and school meals during COVID-19. And lastly, the blog editor also looked for ways to repurpose relevant evergreen content. So one specific example was reposting a piece on the health and well-being of gig economy workers, which is a very relevant issue that COVID-19 has further exposed inequities around what challenges they face. It was also a post that connected to a call for proposal that one of our teams had open at the time. Oh, sorry. Email. Email is what you find on the left. We send out a weekly email called Advances, and 10 issues of our weekly email were shifted to cover the COVID, what's going on, our CEOs op-eds, latest research, grantee information, op-eds, news stories, you name it. And this was really important for us. And our first issue had like the best open rates of all emails this year so far. So since that time, we've gone back to our normal format, but we continue to call out that COVID collection page that we started curating on our website very early on. Social media, and so this is my wheelhouse. This is the area that I work on at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Immediately, we paused all of our advertising. And on this slide, you can see why. We had these lovely community capsule stories, we call them. They have a very inspiring photograph element. It connects to the brand of our Culture of Health Prize. We don't ask anybody to leave the platform. We're really sharing perspectives of people on the ground. I love this content. However, you could see how these ads are not going to speak to people in their honest times that we're all living in. I've got a bunch of kids here on a playground when playgrounds were closed. I've got 3 different people in a healthcare setting when reality in the healthcare settings was that people were masked up and had face shields on. So these ads did not have a place in our current time of COVID. We paused. We also started to publish less on social media, and you heard earlier how our editorial decisions were made around 4 content priorities. And it was all about laddering, and it continues to be laddering up to those areas of interest. But when we did go back to advertising in April, what did we do? We didn't just say this is what's important because we are releasing it. We thought about our audiences, and we took the data from what was performing best on social, and we boosted those posts. We took content that was already performing well and turned those into advertising. And yes, indeed, all of that content that was performing well had to do with COVID and our priorities areas, building health equity, talking about housing, healthcare access. I also want to just mention the importance of trusted messengers. I think that we believe that the CDC has critical information to share with the public, and they have been hard to hear to this day. So the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has been amplifying their voice on social media. And again, it continues to be critically important to this day as states are at varied stages of reopening. Then there was the campaign that never was. County Health Rankings was expected to release this year in March. It was going to mark our 10th anniversary. This was a big deal. But the team, after close, careful consideration and deliberations, they decided not to roll with the media blitz and the plans. We quietly updated the website and updated the data as we planned to do, but we put our audience first. We put their priorities first. And at that moment, there was no need for us to do any media outreach or marketing to public health audiences. There was an opportunity for us to not add to their plate, not pull them in different directions. It was really being respectful to the audience priorities at that time that we decided to not move forward with any kind of marketing and communication and digital communication efforts. So what I have here is just a simple summary slide. I think that what we in the communications department at the foundation learned was that coordination was vital to ensure that all of us had what we needed to communicate a unified message across different channels, different digital channels, and know who to turn with important questions. At moments, we may have felt like we were bobbing and weaving, but having flexibility and clear priorities helped us push out plans or delay plans that didn't make sense given issues of the day, or prioritize content that needed to be communicated, needed to be shared, messaging that needed to be given out to our audiences because it would resonate with them and add value to their lives. So it was really great that we were able to stay focused and look for ways to be relevant, share experiences with our audiences when need be. So now Nick is going to share with us a few grantee case studies as well.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. I thought it would just be helpful to talk a little bit about things that are right in front of you. So this is the Voices for Healthy Kids new website that launched in February of this year, which feels like ages ago. But soon after it launched, obviously we were amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Voices for Healthy Kids team started to pull together resources from its partner organizations and people that it wanted to lift up as trusted messengers as well, and created this COVID-19 resources you can use page, which I think was a common thing that a lot of organizations did in order to spread information really quickly and to get kind of a wide variety of things that could help people. So the Voices for Healthy Kids website was supposed to have a big red donate button up at the top right. And what we did is we actually, without any coding or anything, just went into the back end of the website and changed that button to a COVID-19 resource button that went straight to that page. So I just thought it was a very small but good example of doing something that's right in front of you that can help. We didn't have to redesign the homepage. We didn't have to rethink anything else. We kind of had this built in, and all we had to do was decide to change it that way. And so the Voices for Healthy Kids team changed that. We moved donate to their navigation for now. And I think when and if those resources seem like they don't need to be as prominent there, they'll get moved. But for right now, it's still that way if you go to their website now. County health rankings and roadmaps. So Erin just talked a little bit about the big change that happened for them on their 10-year anniversary, but then they also started to create new things. So they launched an entire webinar series related to the COVID-19 response and recovery, fitting within kind of their messaging and the work that they do. And so this next slide shows a couple of the webinars that they've put together and some of the topics there. I thought it was just a really great overview of the things that they were able to pull together in response to the pandemic, with content, with some of their experts, with their partners, with people they knew, and put something together. So. This last one is an example from the Aspen Institute. The Aspen Global Innovators Group has a ton of different fellows from across the world, actually, who are specialists in what they do from community health perspective, sexual and reproductive health perspective, and other places like that, and other industries like that. They decided to put together Aspen Health for All as a section on their website. They brought their fellows together for webinars, as you'll see in some of this content. They had them do short, made-for-social videos, direct to camera, talking about the work that they're doing and how it's related to the pandemic, or how the pandemic has impacted the work that they're doing. And I like that this was a kind of interesting global example, because all of their fellows are from across the world, providing a perspective on COVID-19 from that kind of global aspect. And so you can check the hashtag. A lot of the other Aspen groups within the Aspen Institute started sharing Aspen Health for All work. I know it was a part of their Aspen Health and Ideas Festival. And so just an interesting way to kind of pivot and start creating content under an umbrella and doing a bunch of different things with the experts that you have on hand and the content that you have on hand that can provide some unique perspectives, maybe from people, to Erin's point, that aren't being heard.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah.
So something else we wanted to make sure we covered were a few areas of messaging best practices. What you see here has been adapted from a resource from the Communications Network called Crisis Communication Resource Guide that was released a few weeks ago. And for reflecting on that guide and reflecting on how the foundation was able to manage, pivot, prioritize communications over the past 120 some odd days, I felt like these 6 rose to the top for us. It's really important that you lead with facts. And we at the Foundation are an evidence-based organization, and we believe that surfacing the most critical, timely, relevant research is how we can establish trust. We also think that it's important that we share a perspective or a point of view when we're putting out content on social media, and we do that in a very brief and clear manner. Keep it simple, right? As simple as that. Jargon doesn't make us sound smarter. It just makes it harder for everybody else to understand. Jargon doesn't lead to a thumb stop. What leads to a thumb stop is being very human, expressing empathy. That also helps us with that trust factor. And so we like to use colloquial language. We want to make sure that our messages don't sound like they're canned, that they're not coming from a human. Think about writing social like you're writing for a friend, and that will actually help your content perform better. And it's really important you understand where your social network, where they are with prioritizing the news that they're consuming, how they're feeling, how they're reacting, if they're under special stress right now, and thinking about how to make sure your messages are coming out at the right time and communicating inclusion and equity, that we are all in this together, and that we as an organization, our continued commitment to supporting our communities during and after public health crises. The fourth area here is about promoting simple actions or sharing stories of people taking action. And this was actually from the CDC manual. It reads, giving people meaningful things to do calms anxiety, helps restore order, and promotes a restored sense of control. So when I look at that guide from ComNetwork, they say things like actions need to be very clear and straightforward. People are actually more likely to take actions when we see others taking action, which is why it is so important to see images of people wearing masks when they're not social distancing in quite simply our website and in our page share images and in our social images. And so again, with the simple language and keeping it simple, if you're promoting actions, those actions need to be simple too, because people will be discouraged by complexity. Using graphics, illustrations, or visual language. Those are also ways to encourage the thumb stop. It's also ways to be simple, be human, and expressing empathy. And lastly, something that you've heard us talk a few times about, elevating our trusted messengers, or finding space to give to those trusted messengers. I think it's really important that in the work we did, that we were amplifying and quoting really credible experts throughout the past few weeks and months. In summary, Nick will take us through our final prepared slide, and then we'll have plenty of time to get to your questions and answers.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. So we just wanted to recap a few things that we talked about today. First is that we are not saying don't do anything online when a rapid response moment happens. What we're saying is to keep doing important work with the right judgment and with context. Think about your audience, be nimble, think about what's in front of you. Make sure you're checking tone and vetting with as many people as possible. This is a place where equity comes into play, who's part of that process. And also just make sure that you are thinking about where this content's going, the experiences your audiences are having, and what they're looking for from you. Next up is experiment. Oftentimes you've had really interesting ideas that maybe you couldn't pull off because of resources or timing. Sometimes these rapid response moments make it possible to plan some of that. Maybe you wanted to do an Instagram Live, but weren't really ever sure if you should. Maybe you wanted to start a new Facebook group for your supporters so they could be more connected. Consider it and try it if you can answer the strategic questions about, is it valuable to your audience in that moment, and can you provide consistency? We don't want you to experiment at the expense of your audience, but sometimes these are moments where actually trying something new is the perfect time. Aim for authenticity. So if it doesn't fit, doesn't make sense for you to be saying something, doesn't make sense for you to be doing something, or you can't make it feel authentic for your audience and for your organization, skip it. You don't need to just join in for your organization to follow its mission. Instead, sometimes you can find and lift up those trusted messengers that Erin's been talking about. This might be a time to amplify and to support other people who are experts or other organizations who are doing work in this space, and to take a step back. And then finally, unless you are participating in a boycott of ads, and there are other ads platforms out there, you should still spend on digital advertising when you have content to get in front of audiences. Most of the rapid response moments that I've been a part of where spending on digital advertising has happened, I didn't see negative impacts on metrics. So of course, if you're participating in a boycott like on the Facebook platform or any other platform, we're not advocating for spending there. But what we're saying is, we hear this question a lot of, well, should I still run ads during this rapid response moment? If the content of that advertising makes sense and meets all the other criteria, there's nothing that has shown that it shouldn't. In fact, sometimes if you have really important information, resources that can help, or you're promoting something that can help your audience, getting it in front of them and paying to do that can be helpful when you have that resource.
Okay, so now is time for our Q&A. We're actually doing really good with time. It's 2:36. I have help moderating the chat. And I also want to give everybody a chance now. If you have a question, if something resonates with you, feel free to put that in the chat now. Ask us some questions. We'll get to as many as we can today. And just know that if there's anything we don't get to, today's slides, this presentation, the slides, the recording will all be available on the toolkit, the Grantee toolbox. So I want to ask Nick a question. I'm going to start with this one. We've talked a lot, when we started developing this presentation, we really were focused on COVID-19. But not everything rises to that scale and size of a global public health pandemic, right? So Nick, are there other moments that are smaller scale that helps an organization say, what should I be tracking and monitoring out there that's happening with my audiences? And what's that threshold for deciding when to make pivots in response to current events?
I really think the answer is it tone deaf not to, and will your audience get value from you doing it? So if you're a local nonprofit and something happens in your local community that, right now I'm in Texarkana, Texas, and my wife's family's house, right? But so if I was a local nonprofit here in Texarkana and something major happened in this community, that impacts my audience and I need to change, right? So it's really understanding who the people are. As you get bigger, as you become a national organization, I think it's a little bit harder to understand, and sometimes those smaller things don't push you to pivot. But I do think that the key is just kind of understanding who your audience is. A lot of the times people build online followings and they're not really sure, or they have an assumption about their audience, but they actually don't know everything about them. If that's where you are, I'd recommend starting to get to know them. You might consider an audience survey, either via email or even on social, for them to fill out to tell them a little bit about who they are, tell you a little bit about who they are. You might consider looking at the Facebook analytics or the Twitter analytics of who's following you and the demographics of that, and really to get to understand them. But it's important to know who you're talking to and who they are, because their experiences change. So I don't know that there's necessarily like a place to pivot. I really think it's about if your audience is facing something, experiencing something, and your content won't make sense at that moment, or you need to change, or it's going to impact the results. We're in the business of communicating public health information all the time, things that are really important. And it's not just a bummer if we go out at a time where people are distracted. It also means that people aren't getting information that's actually really helpful to them. So it can be helpful to frame it in that way. How can we make sure that most people that need to see this information can see it? And that starts with knowing, like, what are their lives right now, and are there things that are going to distract them or that make this it's not gonna land and people aren't going to pay attention. So I hope that's helpful. It's a little hard to call, but I think in general it's keeping a pulse on what's happening in the groups that you're serving and that you're a part of.
Yeah, I would say that I think too, understanding your audience is so critical. And so from the Robert Johnson Foundation, our most important audiences are going to be our grantees. They're the front line to the communities out there doing the work. And so our first thing is, if this is affecting our grantees in some way, is there something they need from us or something they need to know from us? And if it's relevant, if there's something happening with them, we have to get involved. Public health audiences, it's another priority for us. And so when COVID happened, we had already been planning on getting engaged in National Public Health Week, which happens every first week of April. But where we are faced with this emerging global crisis, states were going on lockdown, and we decided we needed to take a step back, because public health officials at that time weren't trying to have happy Twitter chat conversations with people at 3 o'clock every Tuesday. We needed to think about the audiences and what they had a bandwidth for. I think that, again, knowing your audience, even at any scale, something doesn't have to rise to a national perspective in order for your organization to stop and take notice and think about, is this a moment for us to provide really important value or relevance for that audience? So I'm going to go back into our questions. So we've got another good one here, I think, that has similar threads. So how do you balance your personal feelings about recent unrest in our country with social media posts for your organization that might stray a bit from what you think should be said or not said? Another similar question I'll put out there is that for nonprofits that are nonpartisan, there are unique challenges in creating a voice and expressing empathy. Any advice or case studies on specific challenges that nonpartisan organizations have faced in crisis communications and how they respond by deepening their connection with their audience?
Yeah, just some light questions there.
Yeah.
So I think that the best thing to do to prepare for rapid response moments is to think about them before they happen. So unfortunately, in our country, we have a lot of examples of moments where we've had to rapidly respond to anti-Black policing, to unrest in some way, and all of the kind of things that are facing people who don't look like me or you, Erin. And I think that if an organization hasn't thought about their approach to those things that do exist in our world right now, this hopefully was a reminder to do that. But we should also be thinking about what we're not thinking about. And so it's sitting in a room and saying, you know, are we prepared if X thing happens? What would we say? How would we say? What is our approach? The worst time to be thinking about those things is during them. And so having an organizational approach to talking about these topics, where the line is, what you're legally allowed to say as an organization, what your employees or your staff members will say, all of that conversation, I think, is better done ahead of time. And I think that can help with some of this. I don't have all of the answers on what you can and can't say or how you should say it. I think my personal philosophy has been to push organizations that I've been a part of to prepare for that. And to also push for equity and who's involved in those conversations and those decisions, so that internally those conversations are happening and that communications teams are prepared and staffed in a way to where mistakes won't be made that could be traumatic for some of the audience members, or mistakes aren't made that could actually just represent the organization in a bad light.
I agree with you, Nick. I think being prepared is really important. Being prepared for the types of change and the good that you want to see in the world, and being able to jump in and celebrate it, and being prepared for the things that are going to be negative, the things that are going to pull us further away from a culture of health, further away from health equity for all in America. And so I would encourage those who have a media team or media relations contact, or working with the communication firms that are available through our theme communications officers, of working with those folks and saying, help us be prepared. We want to think about ways that we can be responsive to our audience in these 2 or 3 areas. Let's do some digging. Let's see what areas are really important for us that we would want to speak out on if this happened. Here's course A if it goes the way we want it to. Here's course B if it doesn't. We at the foundation have something that's, the terminology might be a little heady, but it's called the decision memo process. And so when we are thinking about speaking out, we have a process that we follow to help certain key people. We pull in different folks from programming, from legal, from communications, from our health equity members, and we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion group. And if we're thinking about making a statement on something, we want to get a swath of representation from across the foundation in certain pockets that support this, and say, how should we communicate this? What do we know about this, and what is our perspective on this? So there is a collaborative effort, and there is a weighing of what should be said or should not be said. So you might have dissenting opinions in your organization, but you have this committee that can work through it together quickly to make the best case for your organization and how you want to rapidly respond and use your voice in certain times of crisis. All right, I'm going to go back into taking a few questions from the group. Oh, have you experienced reader fatigue on COVID coverage? I've noticed that a few people did not view recent news that they had shared that had been negative, I guess, and or engage as much on Facebook and Twitter, yet our website traffic has doubled. So that's interesting. I will say that there are times when this might go back to my earlier point about not getting fixed in bad old habits. We have a schedule around how we approach Twitter, and we were always tweeting between 8 a.m. and say about 4 p.m. But the reality is, with a lot of people are doing other things at that moment, so we start shifting our posting time. We might post more between 6 and 9 at night because that might be in correlation with when people are online. So I think that sometimes it's a matter of looking at your times and changing those up, experimenting with new times. But it might also be a signal of your audience maybe not connecting with the content you're sharing, and maybe thinking about what is it that folks do engage with, or what are they seeking out? Are they seeking out information about how to protect themselves or their loved ones? What might be the best thing for you to share for them? Could be an audience content mismatch. But what do you think, Nick? Are there things that you would look out for when people are seeing lower social engagement but higher web traffic? Any recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, well, one, I think that it's probably a case of people are overwhelmed and they found that for their own mental health, they took a break.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of our audiences do have similar reactions or responses, depending on what kind of organization you are. So it doesn't surprise me that maybe all at the same time I reached a point of not wanting to engage with any more negative news and taking a break. So I wouldn't read too much into it. I think what would concern me more if it was over a long period of time. And if it was like, if all of your content started getting lower engagement rates, something's changed with the way your audience wants to hear from you. But I wouldn't be concerned if for a week even you saw a decrease in engagement. I think it's one of those things that's concerning during that week. But as you look back at the full maybe month or 3-month like quarterly review of analytics, yeah, there was a dip here. We had a ton of coronavirus news that we were talking about, and some people probably got exhausted. But I guess I wouldn't let it change my strategy unless it was like a continually decrease to say, okay, the people who are following us don't want this anymore. But I would like to see it as a pattern rather than kind of a one-off.
So there's another question here I wanted to ask.
Sorry, Erin. I just remembered another thing.
Oh, yeah.
If social engagements are down, but your website traffic is up, that might be because people are clicking and then not engaging with the social posts. So if you can look at your traffic, I don't know if the questioner is asking, and they have access to their Google Analytics, but if you're seeing increased traffic from social but decreased social engagements, it means that your audience clicked on the link and moved on and got the information from your website, which is the goal. So sometimes as humans, we only want to do one thing. So it could also just be that people were driving to see what you were doing and they stopped commenting or liking or loving the posts.
Yeah, definitely take a look at your referral traffic. You might see that there was a website or a news article that linked to something that you produced. So paying attention to your referrals might give you some more answers too. So there's a few other lines of questions I want to get to. We have about 10 more minutes. Is RWJF following, participating in, or creating hashtags as part of the response to COVID-19 or racial justice? And so I think that I want to share with all of you that we are thinking at a very high level. What are the conversations of the day? What is it that we want to say, and how can we make that statement very known for our audiences? And so one of those areas, for example, might be that a lot of public health officials are receiving threats. And it's a very challenging time right now to be a public health official. And so we started following that conversation on Twitter. It wasn't necessarily a hashtag, but what we did was we said to ourselves first, so who are the organizations that public health officials are being supported by right now? it's Nature, APHA, and if we had a list of like 10 organizations. Have any of them made recent statements about this? We did that search, and then we looked to see who was talking about it online. We also looked at recent LA Times, Washington Post, New York Times, other media, traditional media, and said who's writing about this. And then we did a Twitter search to say, and who's sharing those articles. We took all of that information in to then decide what is it that we want to do? What do we want to say? How is our brand going to engage? And we made the decision twofold. One is we folded in some talking points for Rich Besser as he's on his media tour. Many of you might be seeing him in lots of op-eds being quoted in The Hill most recently yesterday, on CNN, on Fox News, MSNBC. And so what we did was we did all of that research using Twitter, not even with a hashtag, just by some keywords together, public health threats, public health officials, and by searching URLs of statements and articles written by others. And we started to collect some information and intel. And so we did two things. We folded the talking points into Rich's media talking points, and we then looked at social posts out there and ways for Rich to elevate key stories or engage and reply to those writing those stories. So that's just something to think about. Is it might not always be about hashtags. It might just be taking that step further to say, well, who are the important messengers? What do we want to hear from them? Are they saying it? And what do we want to do with that information? So I really like these two. I'm going to read these two and then have a discussion with you, Nick. It kind of relates to what I was just talking about. Visible leadership from Dr. Besser has been so impressive. Thank you. Thank you. And unusual for a foundation president. How did that come about? And what has the external reaction? What's been the external reaction? And the second to this, I'm a trusted researcher and suggest that I'm a trusted expert. Research activity precludes me doing an all-in on social media, but I could perhaps offer fact-based messaging for others. How do I offer this service or resource? So I'll say that we've got Dr. Rich Besser on one side and my commenter on the other. Rich is super engaged on social. He's on, when we got him as president, he had already had Twitter chats under his belt, an impressive following there. He has a Facebook public figure page. We put him on LinkedIn and I love his presence there. And he's media trained and he is confident behind the camera, right? And then I've got my commenter who, well, I'm not on social, but I've got as much knowledge to share. How do you help guide people who want to serve as trusted resources, find the right niche for them and find their voice in this digital space?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I feel like my first gut is that oftentimes people find social media to be too overwhelming. I don't want to assume that the commenter is lying that they have no time, but I would challenge them to maybe pick a platform. It sounds like likely Twitter would be a good one for them, and to start adding to the conversations of which they're a research expert in, because oftentimes it feels really scary to get in there, but it is actually really important to have people who know what they're talking about in these conversations. So first I would say, even if you just want to be a lurker to see how other people who are like you are sharing content on Twitter, I would, but then kind of push to even once a week or 2 times a week, going on and tweeting and sharing your knowledge and your take on news related to what you work on is what I'd recommend. The other thing is you might find organizations like the nonprofits that are RWJF grantees or others who work in your space and offer it to them. Send them a direct message if they have got a social media manager. You send an email to their director of communications and offer it. A lot of the communications teams that I work with would love to have somebody who was interested in just reviewing things from an expert point of view. It has always made communications work better to have experts who maybe aren't communications experts, but are experts in the things we're talking about, review things. So maybe you offer to be a part of their review team and for them to send you their social content, their one-pagers, whatever you're comfortable with, to serve as an expert in that way. But I think if you have a take, I would try to push and get some of your time there on social to be a part of some of those conversations too.
Yeah, I would say that if you're challenged by social media because of time, because of I can't go from 0 to 100,000 in the next 6 months. One thing I would say is that maybe thinking about what an op-ed strategy would be or a blogging strategy would be, and thinking about who you could partner with on those, co-authoring something, because that might also help you dip your toes into this, being very public about your perspectives and your research, and then helping you then fuel more opportunities for yourself. And then flipping over to Rich, who I love him dearly for how often he tweets, but he's firing on all cylinders. He's checking Twitter every day. He's sharing information. He's checking Facebook. He's going into LinkedIn once or twice a week, seeing what information people are sharing, and he's taking all of that in and learning from it. And he's also an important voice for our brand. And I think that from his media tours, in the beginning, there was some pushback from our staff internally. Why is Rich out there and the bar across the bottom says former CDC acting director? What does this get the foundation brand? And I think it's very important, because of his expertise and his current role, that this is an opportunity for everyone in America to hear more from him, his experience, and the opportunity that this gives us to pivot to health equity. Talking about how there are people being left behind, and no one should be left behind, because everyone should have a fair and just opportunity for health in America. And if we don't have that today, what can we do in this COVID recovery time to ensure those are the building blocks we're putting back out into America for everyone? So I think that we are building media connections this way. We are sharing an important message that doesn't always get out there. And so there are a lot of good benefits coming from those media relationships and speaking opportunities. All right, I'm doing a time check. We've got 3 minutes left. We'll take a final question. How do you push your team to get more creative? Any opportunities, things that you want to share, Dean, about how to be more creative?
Yes, this is a question I get a lot at Burness, actually. I think that time is really important. So sometimes if you know something is coming in 3 months, that's the time to start being creative about it, because you're going to need the rest of the time to actually make it happen. So time is a huge factor. The other thing is really bad ideas, also very important. We have several, my team makes fun of me for some terrible ideas that I've come up with, even for RWJF, that have never seen the light of day. So you really can't be, you just cannot be afraid to be bad. Because out of some of those really bad ideas, there's one aspect that could work or one that couldn't. And so I would just throw everything at the wall, honestly. But the biggest thing that can hinder you is thinking that the first thing that comes out of your mouth is going to be the thing you do. It's very rare. The third thing I would say is it's really important who's in part of those conversations. If it's just me sitting in front of a Google Doc, it's not going to be as creative. So we, to the point of bringing in researchers, but also designers, some of our designers on the Burness team have come up with some of the best digital strategy ideas for the work that we've done with partners. So the same with our communications or media folks, like everybody is using the internet these days. And so a lot of people can be really smart digital strategists that might not be their full-time day job, but they come up with great ideas. So just thinking about who you want in some of those brainstorms when you're being creative is important. I have always done my best work as part of a team. I can't name one thing that I would put on my resume or tell someone I did by myself. So I think creativity really does come from a group, especially in work like this, where we are trying to put forth equity and we're trying to make sure that people are included and all experiences are considered. I can't do that as a white male. And so it's just really important who you have on your team to be creative in that way.
Yeah, I concur with your opportunities to find ways to collaborate and co-create. I also think sometimes timing is definitely going to be challenging. That well-produced video, you're not going to have that out by Friday. And if you need to act fast and communicate fast, you might just have to pull out your iPhone. So I'm going to wrap up now. I really, really appreciate everyone who's still on the line, everyone who tuned in for today's session. This presentation, both the recording and the slides, will be available in the Grantee Toolbox shortly. You can reach out to Nick and myself at any time. Here's our Twitter handles, our LinkedIn bios. You could just Google search us if you'd like. And what will follow in this deck are several resources. There are some resources that get to your question about creativity and some resources around how I can create graphics quickly using some free tools or inexpensive tools. And again, Nick, I appreciate this conversation with you today.
Yeah, it's been great.
I thank you all and hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.